Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion about the status of women in China. And joining me from Beijing is Gao Rui. She is professor at Beijing Foreign Studies University. And here in the studio, Wang Haiyan. She is the managing partner at the China-India Institute. Welcome to you both. It's great to have you on the show. Let's start in Beijing. Gao Rui, women have made big strides in China since 1949. A lot are employed, a vast majority in the workforce. What have been the achievements, but what's left to do?
Because of an official ideological commitment to women's liberation, the Chinese Communist Party, from the very moment it took power, have sought to include women in development and in the socialist construction project. So in comparison with women of 19th century and early 20th century who were faced with universal oppression and victimization, Chinese women of all walks of life have benefited enormously over the years. And I would say that when it comes to reform and opening up a period, the biggest accomplishments has been the expansion of opportunity for formal education on the part of girls. For instance, according to a set of data offered by All China Women's Federation, the enrollment rate of girls in primary school is 98%, equal to that of boys. And female participation in middle school is 47%, and in universities 44%. And so you could almost conclude that women almost enjoy same rights and opportunities in education with men. With this increased level of education and literacy, women of both rural and urban areas are able to venture into career fields that are previously not available to them.
I just want to bring in Haiyan here. Haiyan, do you agree with that, and what more needs to be done?
I agree partially, and I also see a lot of challenges. I do think that the gender equality is one of the biggest achievements and legacy of Chairman Mao's letting women holding up half of the sky. If you look at the basic well-being of women in terms of their literacy rate, in terms of their longevity, in terms of their overall well-being, yes, there has been a big achievement. However, I see several gaps. One is really in the gender income gap. If you look at the annual income of male versus female, the earning powers between female and male, there is still a 30 to 40% gap for similar jobs.
Like here in the United States?
Yes, and then women tend to get lower paying jobs. That's the first gap. Second gap is really the wealth gap. Not only in terms of the annual income earnings, but you look at the assets accumulated under the house heads tend to be men versus a female, there is a huge gap. Majority, I would say 3/4 of the assets, the wealth, are accumulated under the male's head. And third, you do have a power gap. You look at the power in terms of corporate top executives. Women are only less than 10% of the very senior level of the executives in corporations. And it may be a little bit better in private firms, but a very little percentage at the very top in terms of the state-owned enterprises, public offices, etc. And the final gap, and then the political gap, of course, in terms of the highest echelons of political powers, whether you look at the percentage in Politburo, percentage in Central Committee members, and they represent less than 5%. And finally, I do see there is a mentality gap. There is the traditional values of, women, it's better for women to marry well than doing well. And that traditional value is very hard to erode.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I want to go back to Gao Rui in Beijing. Is there a pull of tradition versus modernity here in China, where women are expected to have the traditional roles, but also expected to be part of this fast-changing modern society? And let's add into that this reform of the one-child policy, now two-child policy. Is that an extra burden for women now entering the workplace?
I think women's status will be definitely affected by this new policy because we have to be aware that the childbearing and child rearing job is a full-time job. So without further supporting public policy being formulated to protect women's rights in workplace as well as in domestic sphere, many women, for the majority of Chinese women who cannot afford house helper, they would be left with no option but to quit their job and become full-time housewife because of lack of access to public service such as daycare center. So I think women's status, this will actually form a vicious circle because women then would be further disadvantaged and discriminated against in the workplace and in the job market.
And I want to come back to you on that, but I just want to play a clip of Chinese President Xi Jinping laying out his vision for Chinese women in the 21st century.
China will do more to enhance gender equality as its basic state policy, give play to women's important role as half of the sky, and support them in realizing their own dreams and aspirations in both career and life.
President Xi Jinping there, Haiyan, a big tradition of women's rights being at the forefront of the Chinese Communist Party since 1949
Yes.
and Chinese policy. They have changed this one-child policy to two. Is that going to make a big difference for women?
I think that not in terms of national policy, as President Xi said, that women's equality issue is not just a human rights issue, but also, it's also inclusive, sustainable development. It's very, very important. It has always been the national policy. However, in reality, because of that traditional value of favoring boys over girls, I could see that girls' power in the family could reduce a little. For example, if a family has only one girl, that one girl is going to be the princess. If a rural family can only afford one kid to go to college, and that is that one girl. But suppose you have a girl and a boy, many families may still prefer boys, and also two childs adds to the responsibilities to women, and that could reduce women's ability to fully participate in jobs, in climbing the career ladder. And that actually in the long term may set up a role model for the girls to see their mother to be more of a housewife-driven woman than a full career woman.
That's a very interesting point. Let's expand this out to the rest of the world. How does women's place in China changing place compared to, say, the United States? You spent a long time here, and also other rapidly developing countries, for example, like India.
I think that China has done a significant, great job, in particularly as you compare to other developing countries. And I think that the economic development, really the rising waters lift up all boats in terms of creating well-being, creating wealth, creating job employment. On all of the dimensions, if you compare China versus India, China is far better off. Women's longevity is at least 10 years older. Women's literacy rate is at least 20% higher. In terms of adolescents' fertility rate, India's adolescents' fertility rate is 4 times that of China. That is not good for girls. And when you give birth that early, below 19 years old, and when you look at the percentage of entrepreneurs in China, a quarter of all entrepreneurs are actually female entrepreneurs. That is one of the highest. So, education. Half, not just in primary education, in college education, half of the college students are female. Half of master degrees are female students. Even PhD students, nearly half, 48% of PhD students are female. So when you look at all of these progress, you really have to give credit to the Chinese Communist Party's push to the economic reform. As you compare in terms of gender gaps with the Western countries, gender income gap in China is still bigger than as compared to, say, OECD countries. Wealth gap in China, particularly in rural China, is still significantly bigger than, say, in a rich economy like in the US.
But you have that wealth gap within China, which is dramatic as well. But your point is extremely well taken.
Yeah.
Let's go back to Beijing and Gao Rui. So what policies for the modern working woman in, say, Beijing behind you are needed? Do we need more maternity leave, for example, if someone's going to have a second child? Wage discrimination needs to perhaps be addressed. What would you say?
I think there are a lot of setbacks and disadvantages that have been brought by the latest economic development and also all kinds of reforms in Chinese society. And this kind of disadvantage have been disproportionately borne by women. And I agree with the other host in your studio that there are a lot of setbacks and disadvantage, and traditional patriarchal authority also plays a role here. So you could see that there has been some resurfacing of commercial exploitation of sex, of objectification of women, and also of underground prostitution, pornography, and even polygyny and concubinage. And this new policy of the second child, I think it would complicate and worsen the situation for some of the college girls, for instance, when they go on the job market in the future. I would say the picture is a mixed picture here.
I'm glad to talk about mixed picture because there are successes, and I want to play one, which is Yang Lan. She's the chairperson of Sun Media Group. Knows no introduction in China, but for our global audience, she's really a trailblazer. Let's have a listen.
From print media to the TV industry, Chinese women are more and more taking leadership roles. In my own media company, 60% of the employees are women. And among my senior managers, half of them are women. I think women are very creative and can be great leaders. We are already observing this trend.
Yes, Yang Lan at the World Economic Forum. I smiled when I saw that because we had 3 women bosses and we love working with them. So it was a really interesting fact to see. Haiyan, are women getting to those management positions? You touched on it before, and political power also.
I think that it really, if you look at it across the board, private entrepreneurs, private companies, small, medium, and medium-sized enterprises, all the way to the large state-owned enterprises, the pictures vary. I would say that there are more opportunities for women to start their own businesses. In fact, half of the internet-based companies are started by women. Smaller businesses tend to be owned by female, but as the size of the companies grow larger, particularly in the manufacturing sectors, particularly in the state-owned sectors, you see the percentage of women on the top started to dwindle a lot more. And the hope is, as China shifts more towards a service-based economy, as service sector pick up a higher percentage of the economy, that women would have a lot more senior management positions or ownership positions. One of the in terms of the very effective ways of giving women more power in corporate is, for example, in European countries, like in France, you will have law that specifically require a certain percentage of boardmanships to be owned to be occupied by female. Some of those legal requirements tends to be very effective right away. And sometimes it takes a long time for traditional values to change, for the business practices to change. However, those legal requirements could help. And another factor, and I think that in terms of hiring women, is that you need to have the legal path for women to file lawsuits if there is a discrimination against women, whether it's in the hiring process or in a promotional process. I think that if women begin to see that that legal path is there for them to pursue, and that would, I think, that deter some of the employers from pursuing the discrimination practices.
That's fascinating discussion. We're going to have to leave it there, though. Haiyan Wang here in the studio, thank you so much. And Gao Rui in Beijing, really appreciate you joining us. Fascinating discussion.